So this is the animation that we're going to be creating today. It's going to look like meteorites, but actually it's just blocks of sand that are reaching the camera and crashing into it, and then it explodes. And this is very easy to create. We don't have to use any particle systems. We are going to use geometry nodes. Let's go over here. I've already got the iPhone set up, but the first thing that we actually need to make is some rocks. So I'm going to press Shift A. Let me turn on my screencast keys, by the way. I'm going to press Shift A, mesh, and bring in an icosphere. Then I will go into the modifiers tab and I will add a control 2. Now I'm going to add a modifier and it's going to be displace. So I'm going to search for displace, and right over here there's a button, new, and then we get this little button right over here and it will take us to the texture tab. I'm going to click on it, and instead of an image remover we want to use clouds. So with the clouds we already get a pretty interesting looking result. I'm going to shade this smooth real quickly and see what we got. I'm going to play around with the size. It should probably be a little bit more to have it, well, a bit more rock-like. Then go back into the modifiers and play around with the strength and see what you like in order to get a beautiful looking rock. Well, I think this looks pretty rocky. I'm going to duplicate it. Shift D, bring it over to the side, and I'm actually going to apply both of these. So apply this, apply that. And then in this one, we actually want to change some settings, and we want to go into edit mode and play around with our icosphere. So I'm going to press O, and I'm going to deform this to make it look more like a different type of rock shape. Something very beautiful looking, like this, and now that already looks like a different rock. Now of course we can play around with the strength and the texture as well, so maybe we want this one to be a bit rougher around the edges, maybe give it an extra level of subdivision, who knows, maybe even more and more. No, I'm just kidding, we're just going to do 3. I think this looks like a pretty detailed and interesting looking rock as well, and maybe we can even place that one upwards a little bit. Pretty detailed looking rock there. The more detail you have, the better probably, but it should still look like a rock and not like, well, a spiky ball. All right, I'm going to duplicate this once again, and then I'm going back into this object, go to the modifier stack and apply everything, and then I will go into this one. And you know what, we're just going to try and make this better. I'm going to reshape this rock, should be a little bit different. Once again, duplicate it, Shift D and Y, let's bring it over there. And this one we want to be a whole lot smaller, so I'm actually going to select all of this, scale it down and bring it in there. Something like this, and we get this really small looking stone over there. So let's apply all of this, and let's apply this as well. I do believe that this should be enough for our rocks. So I'm going to select all of them, place them in a new collection. I'm going to call it rocks. And now we need to make a geometry node setup. So what I'm going to do is I will add a UV sphere right over there. Go to the geometry nodes tab, click on new, and I'm going to delete the group input. I'm going to bring in a UV sphere, you guessed it. I'm going to plug it in there, and let's see what we've got. Now we want to be able to manipulate the scale of this UV sphere because it should be going outwards and inwards, and we can do that real easily using the transform geometry. So transform geometry, I'm going to add it to this line, and now we get some options to scale this UV sphere, for example. But of course this is not really the end result, so we have to add in a instance on points, and we don't want to add a distribute points on faces. The reason for it is that it might flicker if it moves, and that's very annoying about the distribute points on faces. So in this case we just have to use the instance on points and instance it on our UV sphere. And we've got a collection with rocks, so I'm going to take this collection, bring it right over here, and I will plug it into the instances. But of course it's all set in a weird direction. They are instanced on each other very annoyingly, so I'm going to set it to relative, separate children, reset children, and pick instance. And now we have several different rocks on this location, but of course we can scale it down, and now you will actually see what is going on. So it is placing our different rocks on different vertices of this UV sphere. That's basically what's going on. So if we decrease this scale, that is the idea. I'm going to decrease the scale. Let's select it and maybe bring it somewhere over here. Not really the way that we want it to look, but it is starting to move into the right direction, because from here on out we can actually say, all right, explode. You know, go outwards of each other like this. But of course this is all very uniform, and that's not what we want. So I'm going to add a random value, and this one can go right over here, and I'm going to plug it into the scale. And this one we can go and set it right over there, but it should be set to vector as well because it's for the rotation. So this one, well, of course 1 is maybe a little bit too high, so we are going to decrease this rock size until we get something decently shaped. And these are way too big. We want them to be very small actually. We just want to increase the amount of them. So maybe like 0.02 should do the trick. Yeah, something like this should be enough. And we also want to change their rotation because they are all moving in the same direction. So let's set the rotation right in here. I'm going to set this to minus 0.44, and let's play around with this until we get something that we like. Something like this. Looks pretty interesting to me. Now it's already a little bit better than before, but we're still not there. And of course, if you change the scale of this, it is already turning into a different kind of rock. So it's already looking very interesting. But there are a couple of things that we need to do, because this is not really the rock shape that we want it to look like before it lands on this camera glass. Add a set position node right here. Set position right after the UV sphere, and I'm going to plug a noise texture in. So I'm going to bring this noise texture right there. We also have to add a vector math node, otherwise the entire position will be displaced, and I'll show you what I mean. The rock is moving just a little bit. Did you see it? There you go. The rock is moving just a little bit, but if we add a subtract in the vector math and set this to 0.5, then it should stay on the same position. Now if we play around with the scale, we can create different types of rocks. You can also decrease the detail in this case in order to make it go outward just a little bit more. And you know what? Play around with the distortion, things like that. Play around with the scale, and you can create a different type of rock shape. And now this looks a whole lot more like a rock instead of a UV sphere. So that's what we did right over here. But there's one more thing that we should add, and it's going to come in handy later on, because we want to have the normals of this UV sphere. And I'm going to capture those normals using an attribute node. So let's find a store named attribute. I'm going to place it right in here. This should be set to vector, and I'm going to capture the normal. And basically what happens if you add a node like this, it is going to read the normal, so it's going in here and it's going back all the way over here, and it's taking the normal position of the UV sphere. So if we plug it in here, and it's going to read it from this green line. So we've got the normals of the UV sphere now, but we need to give it a name. So I'm just going to call it normie. Very cool. So now we've captured the normals. We have got our rock displacement, which is happening right over here. We've got a way to adjust the scale of this if we want to make a different size or shape of the rock. We've got some random values that really made sure that this doesn't look like a UV sphere anymore, but more like a rock. But there's one problem. It's not exploding. So we have to add that as well. And the way that we want to explode it is that if it explodes, all the stones should rotate around. And we only want it to explode on the normals without going through the iPhone, because if it is exploding and all these stones are passing through this mesh, it will not look good. So we have to find a way to fix that. But first I'm going to add in a rotate instances. I'm going to plug it right in here, and I'm going to add a set position node and another one as well, because that's exactly what we need. I'm going to place this one somewhere further in the back. So let's think about this. So let's do the set position node first. Actually, what we want to add is another noise texture, because we want it to be displaced. If you do it on the normals and it's just a UV sphere, which we captured the normals of, it will be very uniform. It will go out like this. But we actually want it to go out with some are a little bit farther that way, some are a little bit farther that way. And we're going to use the noise texture in order to get that to work. So the noise texture makes sure that we get some randomization in this normals, basically what I'm saying. So I'm going to add a vector math node once again, set it to subtract, and minus 0.5, and color into the vector. And this one can go into the offset of the set position. Now you can already see something is happening, and if we play around with the scale, it looks quite interesting. You could do something like this. This is also a very cool way to make a weird looking animation if you would like to do that. But there's a couple of things wrong with this. So I'm going to set this to 20, and this is now the way that our rock is being displaced. And that looks very good. However, it is not really exploding. We just messed our rock up basically. And we got to change some things here in order to drive this animation, because if we can't animate it, then we've got a problem. And you don't want to scale it like from 0 to 20, because it will look weird and it will go in all directions, because, well, that's just the way the noise texture works. And so we have to isolate some part of this. And luckily, we already got our store named attribute right here. So I'm going to bring it in this space. So I'm going to bring in a named attribute, and I will call it normie, and it will automatically change it to vector, by the way, if you do that, because that store named attribute was a vector, and in this way you know that you typed it correctly. This normal attribute we are going to use, so let's have a look at the offset. It's actually distributing it from the normals of the UV sphere, exactly as predicted. So if I take this, let's say subtract, but I'm going to set it to multiply, and we play around with this, you can see that it is moving outwards exactly according to the normals that we stored right over here from the UV sphere. So I hope that's very clear and you know what we did there, but that is basically the idea. Now we want to combine this together with our noise texture in order to make sure that it's not as uniform as this. As I mentioned before, this is simply going outwards in the shape of the UV sphere. We actually want to combine it with the noise texture in order to make it look good. So I'm going to add a multiply node right over here, and the noise texture with the subtract should probably go in there. And now if we play around with this, we actually get a pretty cool looking rock explosion. But as I mentioned before, there is a problem because the rocks are also moving through this iPhone and that won't look very good. Of course, we can fake it by trying to make a different location of the camera, for example, so you won't really notice things going through the iPhone. But that's not what we are going to do. We want to make sure that this is awesome. So I'm just going to set this to 1. And basically I'm going to duplicate this named attribute node. And we want to make some comparisons and separate the X, Y, and Z. Because this is moving on the Z axis, we actually want to exclude anything underneath a certain value. So let's add in a separate XYZ and a combine XYZ right over here. And we should probably also get a compare node. So compare node right over there. I'm going to set this to less than, attribute into A. Let's plug the result simply in the combine XYZ number Z. And let's place this one into the multiply. Now what is happening right over here? If we increase or decrease this, we can see that some of these values are doing something, at least something on the Z axis. But we have no control anymore over our X and Y, which are right over here. So what we should probably do is bring in a math node right over here. I'm going to plug this attribute into the math node, set it to multiply, and I will actually plug this into the X and Y because now we have a way to distribute it on the X and Y, and that's exactly what we want. So now it is moving outwards, but it's not moving upwards anymore. That's annoying, but we can fix that somewhere else in this timeline. But at least if we now click on 1, it won't be able to move through this iPhone anymore. Things are going into this direction. And basically what we can do is add another multiply over here, and the Z value won't do anything, but the X and the Y value will. So we can set it to whatever shape you would like. So maybe this far would be the approximate distance that we want those rocks to fly off. And if we now play around with this multiply right over here, we can sort of determine that like this. And this will simply amplify it, so you don't have to use crazy values on this one. I want to make this multiply the driver of this entire animation. So I want to know a way in order to... Oh, we actually plugged it into the wrong set position. No problem. I'm just going to delete this one. Move the group output to the right, add another set position node. I'm going to use this set position in order to displace the Z axis, but only upwards, so not downwards. And I want this node right over here, this multiply, to be the driver of the entire animation. So everything that is moving towards the side or whatever is going to be driven by this one single node. And that will make it really easy for us to use in the future as well. I'm going to duplicate this multiply and I will plug it right in this one, because now we can use this multiply in a different node stack right over here that's going to determine the Z value. I'm going to take a position node. I want to separate the XYZ, combine it again, because I only want this to happen on the Z axis. Plug it in the offset, but now I want to multiply this with something that has positive values. So let's add in a vector math, because we should be using a vector. It is purple and this one is purple as well. As you can see, those little things, so they connect. And if we play around with this, it is going up and down. It's basically the same as we had before, but now we can change this using a random value. So random value, and I'm going to take this, set it to multiply. And as you can see, it is multiplying it in both directions. Now I'm going to take this multiply, copy it, and this random value should go into the top, and this multiply should go into the bottom. And then this multiply should go into the vector. All right, so there was a slight problem and I fixed it. Instead of the position, we needed to use the normals because if we add in the position, we get some pretty weird looking problems right over here. I'm not sure why it doesn't work, because I did it this way before. I'm using the same values, but in this case, the normals work. Either way, this multiply node should probably be clamped. You can do both, it doesn't really matter that much. It will look like this, poof, or clamped, it will look like this. So a little bit more will stay on the original plane, or output that we've got right here. Of course, we can play around with the random values right over here. So if you wanted to go higher, you can increase this number, but it will also go lower, and that is going to be a problem. So don't go too high. Make sure that something like this is probably fine. We can now use this multiply node in order to get a pretty cool looking explosion out of this. Well, I think it can be a little bit more extreme. We simply have to play around with these values. So we can crank this up a bit more so it goes higher and outwards at the same time. This looks like a pretty cool explosion to me. And we simply have to play around with this multiply output on the X and Y, because it goes higher and you can determine where and how far these particles will go. So, boom, and it's exploding like this. I think that can be pretty cool. So what I've done is I've clamped this multiply node, and you will soon see why we can use this. But we've got this random value, this position into the separate XYZ, but I forgot to add one node. So sorry for that, but we have to add another compare node, because right now if we increase this multiply, it will still move some stones through our iPhone. And that is exactly the problem that we try to solve. But that didn't happen right now. So I'm going to show you a way that we can. I'm going to add in a other compare node. So compare, bring it right in here. And actually you can already see what it does. It is creating some value that is higher than 0 for the Z, because we separated the Z axis, should be higher than 0. And this is exactly what's happening right here. So if I play around with this multiply node, you can actually see nothing is going through the iPhone. It's all moving outwards. And that is exactly what we want. However, I'm going to set it to greater than or equal and play around with this value until we get something like this. But the problem is that now it is going way too high. And there's only two ways to fix that. It is by using this random value node or by using this multiply node. So you can either increase the randomness and decrease the multiply like this, and then you will have something that looks very cool. So let's have a look at this. Boom. Normal stone. Boom, explosion stone. But we've done our best in order to get the best looking result for this without stones going through our iPhone. One thing that we forgot to add is the rotate instances. And it's not very hard actually. We've already created the entire setup. And all we need to do is add this multiply where we've got those values right there. And I'm going to plug this into the rotation. And let's see what it does. If we now play with our multiplication, all of these stones are twisting and turning around, which makes it seem a whole lot more interesting. Here, take a look at this. I'm going to set this to 0 first, and now all of these are moving around, and that gives it this extra cool explosion effect. You can play around with the values, you can play around with the randomness, you can play around with the value of the Z height that we've got over here, or maybe increase the maximum so it goes really high, and play around with all of these cool looking animation. Maybe you want it to be a bit more aggressive like this. I don't. I'm just going to keep it to the values that I already had. And now it looks like a very cool looking rock explosion that is going on right here. So now all we have to do is animate this property. So I am going into frame 0, or let's say frame 10 by the way, and I am going to set this to 0. Right here I want to make sure that it is exactly on the camera lens. So something like this. Don't change the rotation. I'm going to press I. Then on frame 0 I want this to move somewhere over there, and I'm going to rotate it around as well. So now it's bam, moving into this like so. And on frame 9, we want this to be 0 value on this multiply. And what I'm actually going to do is bring in a group input and plug this value right over here. Then click on N. And we've got our node, we've got our group and this value. I'm going to call it animate. And we can animate this value right now from the modifier stack. And that's a little bit more intuitive. So let's go ahead and press on I right here on 0. And then let's go to frame 30 maybe. And let's increase this so it explodes. And press I. And then on frame 100, it should still be going, but a little bit slower, as if it's slow motion. So let's see what this looks like. Boom. And then it's going into its slow motion. Of course, we should set this to linear. We can maybe do some Ave Maria, something like that. Moving in slow motion, we can maybe rotate the camera around, and maybe it should speed up again after that. But one more thing that we can do is actually take this entire block and somewhere over here, or maybe on frame 100, I'm going to select this. I'm going to move it towards this side ever so slightly, because it was in that motion, you know. So it is still moving in that direction, just a little bit. So let's click on cycles, and we need to add a material to this. But first I'm going to add an HDRI. So let's go to cycles, click on create world nodes. Let's take this, let's set the sky strength to 0.5 perhaps. And let's go back to geometry nodes. We should add a material. So I'm going to add a new material, and I will call this rocks. And then I'm going to add a set material node. Set material and call it rocks. And then I'm heading over into the shader editor, drag this upwards, shader editor, Control Shift D, rock 34 is probably pretty cool. You can also do a sand colored one, which will probably also look pretty cool. This is what the texture looks like, not bad. We can also change the scale right here in the texture coordinate node. And this is basically what it looks like for now. What we can do is go over here, set the film to transparent because I don't want to see the HDRI. I'm going to add a light area lamp, increase this size and bring it upwards. Have it come from the side like this, increase the power, and maybe we can add a camera, like right over here. Press N, let's bring this down. Working in a very small screen right now, sorry guys. Set this to timeline again. And you know what, maybe the HDRI can exist. There's no problem, we can just simply make it transparent, and all we have to do now is make sure that the camera has a focus point. So empty, let's add the arrows, let's go into the camera, depth of field, let's turn it on, let's set it to the empty that we just created, and play around with these values in order to make something look very cool. So the background is now blurred and it looks like this. Let's see what this animation looks like. Now, we have covered in other tutorials how you can move the camera, stuff like that. I want you to think about this. This is only about the explosion of the stones, and this is the way that you actually do it. So figure out a cool camera position for this. Maybe you have a still camera, maybe you have a moving camera, and I want you to be creative with that. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and if you did, click on subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.
I get the money and it's right on cue. Keep the duffel bag up inside my coupe. Hold a couple racks, tell them I love you. You wanna be a boss, do it like I do.